There's a specific kind of loneliness that shows up when you start changing. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who knew you one way and no longer recognizing the person you're becoming. You start setting boundaries. You start saying no. You start pulling back from dynamics that used to define you. And the people around you, they notice, but they don't celebrate it. They don't understand it. They feel the absence of the version of you they were used to. And suddenly, the spaces that used to feel like home don't fit anymore. The conversations feel surface level. The relationships feel strained. And you start wondering if maybe you made a mistake. If maybe change wasn't worth this. Because no one told you that growth would feel like this. That it would feel like standing on the outside of your own life, watching everyone else continue on while you're trying to figure out who you are without the roles you used to play. And the question that follows is always the same. Why does doing the right thing feel so isolating? Here's what I want you to hear. This loneliness isn't proof that you're doing it wrong. It's proof that you're in transition. This video is about why starting over feels so lonely. It's about what happens when people who witnessed your old identity can't see the new one yet. About why approval disappears before alignment arrives. And about why this phase, as painful as it is, isn't punishment, it's recalibration. This won't promise you that the loneliness will end tomorrow. It won't tell you that the change is easy if you just stay positive. But it will help you see this isolation for what it actually is. Not a destination, but a transition state. And that changes how you move through it. Let's start with something most people don't expect. When your identity shifts, you lose your witnesses. What does that mean? It means the people who knew you before, who understood you, who saw you, who reflected back the version of yourself you were performing, they were witnessing a specific identity. And that identity made sense to them. It fit. It was predictable. But when you start changing, when you stop performing that version, they don't have a reference point anymore. They don't know how to see you. They don't know how to relate to you. Because the person they knew isn't showing up the same way anymore. And here's the thing. They might not be hostile. They might not even be unsupportive. But they're confused or uncomfortable or quietly disappointed that you're not who they thought you were. And that confusion, it creates distance. Not intentional distance, but distance nonetheless. Because when people can't recognize you, they can't witness you. And when you're not being witnessed, when no one around you understands what you're going through, why you're changing, what it's costing you, you feel invisible. And that invisibility, that's loneliness. Not because you're alone, but because you're unseen in the presence of people who used to see you clearly. Now, let's talk about approval, because this is where the loneliness gets sharper. When you were performing the old identity, when you were saying yes, accommodating, being useful, being easy, you got approval, you got validation. You got the feedback that told you that you were doing it right. And that approval, it felt like love. It felt like belonging. It felt like proof that you mattered. But here's what no one tells you. Change often costs belonging before it creates alignment. When you stop performing the old identity, the approval disappears. Not all at once, but gradually. People stop reaching out as much. They stop relying on you the same way. They stop giving you the feedback you've been using to regulate your sense of worth. And in that absence, you feel the void. You feel the gap where the validation used to be. And your system panics. Because if approval equals safety, then the loss of approval feels like danger. And this is where most people turn back, not because they don't want to change, but because the loneliness of losing approval feels unbearable. It feels like confirmation that they're doing something wrong. But they're not. They're just in the gap, the space between the old identity that no longer fits and the new identity that hasn't fully formed yet. And in that gap, there's no external validation. There's no audience. There's no one cheering you on or telling you that you're on the right path. There's just you and the quiet, uncertain work of becoming someone different. And that's lonely. Not because you failed, but because alignment, the kind where people see you for who you actually becoming, that comes later, much later. First, there's this, the in-between, the waiting, the isolation of being the only one who knows why this matters. Here's the third thing. There's grief in shedding former versions of yourself. People talk about change like it's all forward motion, like you're just adding something new, but that's not how it works. When you change, you're not just becoming someone new, you're letting go of someone old. And that old version, they're not all bad. They kept you safe. They earned you love. They got you through. And even if that version wasn't sustainable, even if they were built on performance and people-pleasing and self-abandonment, they were still you. And losing them feels like loss. It feels like mourning someone who's still alive, because the person you used to be, they're gone. And the people who loved that version, they might not love this one. And that's terrifying, because it means you're risking not just approval, but connection. You're risking the relationships that were built on the old version of you. And you don't know yet if new relationships will form around the version you're becoming. So you're in this liminal space where you've lost the old but haven't gained the new, where you're grieving a version of yourself that you chose to leave behind. And that grief doesn't make sense to anyone who hasn't been through it. Because from the outside, it looks like you're improving. It looks like you're getting healthier. It looks like you're doing the right thing. But on the inside, you're mourning. You're grieving the sense of an old identity, the predictability, the belonging, even if it wasn't real, even if it wasn't sustainable. And no one talks about that. No one warns you that growth will feel like loss before it feels like freedom. Here's the fourth thing, and this is critical. Loneliness is a transition state, not a destination. This is what you need to hold on to when it feels unbearable. This is temporary, not in a it'll be over tomorrow way, but in a this is not where you're staying way. Because right now, you're between identities. You're between worlds. You've left the old one, but you haven't fully arrived in the new one. And in that transition, loneliness is inevitable. Because the people who knew the old you can't fully see the new you yet. And the people who will recognize the new you, they haven't shown up yet. But they will. Not immediately. Not on a timeline that you can control. But as you continue to become more aligned with who you actually are, as you stop performing and start embodying, you'll start attracting people who see this version, who understand it, who don't need you to explain it. And those connections, they will feel different, not because they're more intense, but because they're real, because they're based on alignment, not approval, on who you actually are, not who you've been trying to be. But you can't skip the transition to get to that. You can't bypass the loneliness. You have to move through it. And moving through it requires you to tolerate the discomfort of being unseen, of not being validated, of not knowing if anyone will ever understand what this cost you. But here's what I need you to know. This phase isn't punishment, it's recalibration. Your system is learning to regulate without external approval. Your identity is stabilizing without the old feedback loops. You're proving to yourself that you can exist, that you can matter, that you can belong, even when no one is witnessing it. And that's not loneliness as failure. That's loneliness as transformation. So let's bring this together. If starting over feels lonely, if you're standing in the middle of your life feeling disconnected from everyone who used to know you, it's not because you made the wrong choice. It's because you are in transition. And transition is lonely because you've left the old identity behind, but the new one hasn't fully formed yet. Because the people who knew you before don't recognize you now. Because the approval you used to rely on has disappeared and the alignment you're moving toward hasn't arrived yet. And you might be feeling something right now. Maybe sadness, maybe fear, maybe a deep ache that no one around you understands what you're going through. That's valid. That's real. That's part of this. Because change often costs belonging before it creates alignment. And that cost, it's not small. It's not insignificant. It's not something you can just push through without feeling it. You're grieving. You're mourning. You're navigating the space between who you were and who you're becoming. And that space is disorienting. It's isolating. It's harder than anyone told you it would be. But it's also proof that you're doing it. That you're not just talking about change, you're living it. And living it means being willing to stand in the discomfort of being unseen while you figure out who you are without the audience. And that's courage, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that no one applauds because no one knows it's happening. But it's happening, and it matters. No one talks about how much support real transition actually requires. They talk about the outcome. They talk about the transformation. They talk about how good it feels on the other side. But they don't talk about this part, the lonely part. The part where you're doing everything right and it still feels like you're walking through it alone. And maybe you are walking through it alone right now. Maybe the people around you can't see what you're building. Maybe they don't understand why you had to leave the old version behind. But that doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means you're ahead of them. You're in a place they haven't reached yet, and that's always lonely. But loneliness isn't a destination. It's a transition state, and you won't stay here. You don't have to know when it ends. You don't have to have proof that it's worth it. You just have to keep going.